Shabbat Shalom, it's Friday again, and this time it's Parashat Bo. In Parashat Bo, we mostly learn about the last three plagues, the plague of locust, the plague of darkness, and the plague of Makat Becharot, the death of the firstborn. And I want to take a moment to touch on a fascinating midrash, a rabbinic take on the story of Choshech, on the Makkah, on the plague of darkness. So the plague of darkness, as it says in the Pasuk, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, and God said to Moses, Netei yadcha al hashamayim, raise your hands to the sky, Veihi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, and there shall be darkness over Egypt. Vayamesh choshech, and indeed there was a very thick darkness. Vayet Moshe et yado al hashamayim, Veihi choshech afela b'chol eretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. For 3 days there was darkness over all of Egypt. Velo ra'u ish et achiv, and no one could see their fellow brother. Velo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim, and everyone basically stayed put for 3 days because of the dark. Ulachol bnei Yisrael, but for all of the Jews, haya or b'moshvotam. The Jews had light, while the rest of the nations around them, specifically the Egyptians, were in darkness. Now, this is Makat Choshech, 3 psukim, and that's all that we have. But Chazal have a very famous midrash that Rashi, the medieval commentator, brings on our pasuk and says, why does it mention explicitly that the Jews had light for 3 days, while the non-Jews were in darkness for 3 days? Isn't it obvious that most of the different plagues that happened did not afflict the Jews? The Jews did not have frogs, the Jews did not have blood, the Jews did not have hail, and so on and so forth. So why, again, do we need to keep mentioning this? So there's a very interesting midrash that says, during these 3 days, a lot of Jews died. And purposefully, they died and were buried within these 3 days so that the Egyptians could not see the suffering of the Jews because they were in darkness. And that way the Jews were able, as it says in the Midrash, to bury their dead without having the jeers and smirks of the Egyptians saying, hey, look, you guys are dying just as much as we are. Now, what is the story of that Midrash, and who are these Jews that are dying? So the Midrash continues to say, these are the Jews who were evil, who did not want to leave Egypt. And God punished them by killing them off in this plague. And they were buried quickly and silently in the plague of darkness so that nobody knew about it. And these were, that way we kind of got rid of all of these evil Jews that didn't want to leave Egypt. And that way they were no longer an issue. Now, obviously the Midrash is coming to teach us something very important. And we have to try and analyze what is the message of the Midrash. The Midrash is not there to give us fact. It's not there to give us deleted scenes, right? A director's cut of the story. The Midrash is trying to teach us a very important idea. And I would like to propose an understanding of this. And for those of you who have been in one of my classes on Midrash, you might have heard this before. But I think here the Midrash is trying to say the following. When it comes to the Jewish people, there is never one consistent viewpoint about anything in Judaism. Every single idea is always contended, as we like to say, 2 Jews, 3 views. But nonetheless, you might expect, wait, we all want to leave Egypt. Isn't that clear? We don't want to be slaves. We don't want to be, punished and persecuted and killed and having our children taken away from us. Isn't that obvious? Isn't that something that we can all get behind as Jews, that we all want to get out of Egypt? And here the Midrash says, no. Even when it comes to the question of Egypt, there was the pro-Egypt lobby. As we actually find throughout the desert, we find there were Jews who constantly said, we should go back to Egypt. Egypt was awesome. This is terrible. And then Egypt was fine. So this whole idea of leaving Egypt itself was a contentious issue in the Jewish people. And that represents every issue. If Egypt is contentious, everything is contentious. And that kind of gives us a perspective on, wait a second, we can never assume that everyone agrees about everything, ever. And yet, the Midrash actually beautifully connects another Midrashic idea and says like this. It says, V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim. And the Jewish people left Egypt armed in order to conquer the land, in order to survive it throughout the desert. They took weapons with them from Egypt. But the Midrash says, V'chamushim Indeed, that means 1 out of 5. And then the Midrash continues, maybe 1 out of 50, 1 out of 500. And in essence, it's saying only a small proportion of Jews actually left Egypt. What about the rest of them? So as asked the Midrash, what happened to the rest of the Jews? The answer is, they're the Jews that died during Makat Choshech. They're the Jews that died in this plague of darkness. What's going on here? I think the Midrash is trying to say that when it comes to moving on in history, when it comes to making the leap forwards, to step out of Egypt and to actually take part in the Jewish story, there will always be those that choose to stay behind. There will always be those Jews that decide that you guys, you want to go out on an adventure leaving Egypt? I'm very happy in Egypt. More than that, it's not 100% clear that all of the Jews in Egypt were treated in the same way. There could have been, just as we find very often throughout many different periods of history, different types of Jews that were maybe treated different ways. Maybe there were the Jews who lived in the ghettos of Goshen and were more identified, more Jewy, and they were more persecuted, while there were the Jews that kind of tried to assimilate into Egyptian society. And we see that the Jews spread all over Egypt. There were probably Jews that had married into Egyptian nobility. We find, for example, Yosef is a Jew who marries into Egyptian nobility a few generations back. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened throughout the ages. We always find throughout every single exile of ours, there are different types of Jews. There are the poor Jews who everyone can point to and say Jew. And then there are the Jews that work in all sorts of different industries that, oh, I never knew you were Jewish. That's interesting. And they kind of lose all of their Jewish identity. So too when it comes here to Egypt. The Jews that left Egypt were the Jews with a Jewish identity. And yet there are plenty of Jews that had kind of disappeared into the woodwork, that had tried to integrate into their non-Jewish environment and pretend that there's nothing Jewish to see here. I'm just a regular Joe. Those are the Jews that left behind. Those are the Jews that married into Egyptian society, that left their Jewish identity behind, that dropped all of their Jewish perspective, their Jewish understanding of history, of God, of legacy, of destiny. All of that, they kind of left for the other Jews, and they decided to make their own paths. When it comes to those Jews, says the Midrash, and by the way, every single exile has those Jews. Every single exile has those Jews that decide to convert into Christianity or Islam, or convert into the secular society that surrounds us and try and kind of hide their Judaism and forget about it. And yet, says the Midrash, you know what happens to those Jews? Those Jews die in darkness. Beautifully. Those Jews don't actually die in full view. And they don't die at all because they're still very much alive. But their Jewish identity, like a candle, has been snuffed out. And now they've disappeared. They've kind of retreated into the darkness. And if you think about it, how many Jews throughout Jewish history have been swallowed up by the nations in which the Jewish people found themselves? How many Jews married into their societies, left their Jewish identity, reneged on all of their familial connections, and just kind of drifted away? What's the story with them? The answer is, says the Midrash, these are the Jews that die in darkness. Since the Holocaust, more than 6 million Jews, according to some statistics, have left the Jewish people in some form or another by kind of, as we said, drifting away and cutting their ties to the Jewish people. As many Jews died in the Holocaust, have died in darkness, have drifted away, and are no longer connected to their community, to their family, to their identity. There are no memorials for those Jews. There are no statues or kind of graves or piles of shoes in Auschwitz. There's no place that we can mourn. There's no date that we can say Kaddish for the Jews that just drifted away and disappeared into the darkness. That, I think, is the message of this Midrash. That every single exile, and the Egyptian exile is the prototype of Jewish exiles. We'll always have those Jews that decide to stay, that decide to never leave, that decide to disappear. They are the Jews that died in Makat Choshech. They are the Jews that die in the darkness. And yet, there's always hope. Always hope. As I mentioned before, really, even though it might seem like a candle that has been snuffed out, there is always an idea of, and indeed, there is in the Israeli national anthem, it starts, Kol od balevav pnima, nefesh Yehudi homia. This Jewish identity is very hard to put out. And one of the beauties throughout all of our Jewish exiles is even those Jews that sometimes start to drift away. There are ways in which they sometimes find their way back into the fold. They find their way to reconnect. They find their way to step out of the darkness. They find their way to, in many ways, rekindle those flames. And there are many, many, many Jews out there who are dwindling. And it is up to us, the Jewish people, to try and not only be a light unto the nations, but to be a light unto the Jews among the nations, and to try and bring closer to their Jewish identity, to strengthen their understanding, to strengthen their relationship with Jewish history, with Jewish present, with Jewish future, with God, with Jewish destiny. All of these things, it is incumbent upon us to strengthen. So I think the purpose of this midrash is not just to inform us what happened, but to warn us that this can happen again. And it is up to us to try and keep as many Jews in the light as we can. Shabbat Shalom.